So before we dive in, just a reminder, my name is Merritt Fry, and I do work with River Network. I'm the Habitat Program Director. And River Network is a national alliance of watershed groups, river groups, tribal members, and others who are interested in protecting and restoring their local watersheds. And so we work with those groups all around the country to essentially help them do what they do better. So we do a lot of this kind of work, training, policy analysis, one-on-one kind of work with groups to help them do whatever it is that they've decided really needs to be done in their watershed. And this webinar is a piece of that work. I want to say from the outset that this is going to be very much an overview webinar, very much a beginning webinar. We really pitched it as an introduction, but it's also going to be an overview of a wide range of issues related to this topic of tribes in the Clean Water Act. And the goal is really to give you that overview, kind of a broad look, and then links to where you can learn more about any of these topics. So we're not going to go in depth on anything, which may be frustrating for some people that are more experts. But the idea is to give you that overview. And then again at the end of the session to give folks that will then have that broad view of the topics a chance to tell us what topics you might want to really dig in and get into more depth on, so that we can then go to that next level on a portion of the topics we'll do a whirlwind tour of today. So that's our goal for today. Let me move forward into our agenda here to tell you how we're going to do that. We're going to do a quick introduction to the concept of the Clean Water Act and most importantly the role of tribes with the Clean Water Act. We're then going to talk about this concept of treatment as state, or TAS, that acronym that I threw out in the questions in the beginning there, define what that means, and a little bit about what the process is for treatment as state with under the Clean Water Act for tribes. Then we're going to do what is truly a whirlwind tour of some of the core Clean Water Act programs, again, just to give you an overview of the programs that are out there that are most relevant to tribes, and a little bit about the tribal roles that are possible under each of those programs. Then we're going to focus in on one of the programs in a little bit more detail, and that's the Water Quality Standards Program, because it's very core to all work under the Clean Water Act, and has been of great interest to tribes over the last several decades. So we're going to spend a little bit extra time on that program. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what you all might be most interested in learning about next. So this is where I mentioned we have some poll questions and some chat ways that we're going to try to get a feel for what would be most you kind of tour of issues. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into that tour. We're going to start with this introduction to the Clean Water Act and, again, the tribal role under the Clean Water Act. But I want to be clear from the outset that although we're going to be focused on the Clean Water Act today, it really is just one option for tribes that are interested in protecting and restoring their waters. So we'll touch on some of the other options that are out there in terms of methods for protecting and restoring waters. But just note that what we're focused on today is the Clean Water Act. And we're focused on it because it is a really good structure for discussing what our priorities are in terms of water quality issues, whether or not we go down the regulatory road. It's just it is an interesting way to think about some of the topics, but it is just a starting point to consider, and by no means the end point, particularly from a tribal perspective. So we're going to discuss these Clean Water Act tools and discuss different ways that you might want to adopt them, incorporate them into your work, and ways maybe that you don't. And that's okay. This is all just for context of one approach to thinking about protecting and restoring water quality. So what is this law that we're going to focus on, the Clean Water Act? Since this is a beginning session, I wanted to kind of start at the beginning. And note that the Clean Water Act we'll be talking about today is really the result of kind of a long evolution of thinking about how to best protect and restore water quality. It's, again, by no means the end of that thinking, of that evolution, or is it the perfection of the evolution? It's not the end point. But what this slide is really really pointing out is that before the law that we now think of as the Clean Water Act, we had a lot of variation in this statutory approach to what we might want to do about water quality. This is just a few of the main attempts over the centuries, basically. And the take home from this is that, there has been a long evolution. We've tried a lot of different things, and the law we're talking about today is just part of that evolving process. Screen in this picture. These are problems that we saw over decades again, but definitely in the 60s and 70s, which is when this photo is from. Problems showed up that proved that the things we had attempted in the past really weren't getting the job done. We're going to test your use of the submit question or chat window here by asking, can anybody tell me a guess on what river it is we're looking at here as we look at the screen? You see lots of people typing. So Katie was first, but a lot of you are getting it here. It's the Cuyahoga in Ohio, the famous river that caught on fire. So you guys have proved you know how to use the chat window, so that's good. So yes, this is an example of the kind of truly egregious pollution problems that the U.S. Congress had in front of them when they were thinking about, again, overhauling our national approach to water quality law, and when the modern Clean Water Act, what we think of as the modern Clean Water Act, was born in 1972. So you can see that they were thinking about some pretty dramatic issues as they were drafting the Clean Water Act. So what was different about this 1972 Act? What makes it kind of what we think of as the modern law? Well, there was quite a bit that was different, but I'm going to feature just a few things here as context for our discussion today. First off, what you have in front of you here on your screen is the objective of the Clean Water Act. And that objective is really broad and I would argue pretty visionary, particularly for the times. So I want to point out a couple things about this pretty short bit of text here. The first is that it talks about the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our waters. A lot of you who are working in this field, it's easy for us to fall into thinking about chemical water quality, things that you can measure in parts per million, things that you can sample in a beaker. Chemical is oftentimes where our mind kind of goes when we think about water quality. But the Clean Water Act really does acknowledge that a healthy, riparian system, healthy wetlands are about chemical, physical, and biological integrity. And that's worth keeping in mind as we talk about the programs today. The Act also was visionary in that it was looking at restoring and maintaining the water quality of our waters around the country. So even though they were faced with these very egregious, rivers on fire kind of situations, Congress wasn't only focused on kind of remediating these truly, big problems. They were also realizing that it was a real benefit to maintain good quality water, good healthy systems where we still had them. So that was part of the real sea change of the 1972 Act. Some other kind of visionary or bold changes that were made in 72 was the incorporation of several goals in the Act. These are paraphrased here. This isn't the actual legislative language. But you'll see, I think that they're kind of stunning, particularly if you think about Congress today. And when you look at them, you can be inspired or depressed or both. But if you look at these they're very visionary, and that's the inspirational piece. So the first one here that's very relevant to a lot of our work today is that all waters will be fishable and swimmable by 1983. Very inspiring. Just basically saying we want all of our waters to be able to support healthy aquatic ecosystems and to be safe for people to recreate in. And Congress set a deadline by 1983. So, that's the part that can be depressing if we look at the dates that have kind of gone by on these deadlines. It can be a little disheartening to think how far we are from achieving those goals. But again, in a Pollyanna kind of heartening way, these are still our national goals in terms of water quality, with no discharge of toxic amounts from the get-go. There's no date even associated with that one. It was just the immediate goal. So you can see that these were, pretty, in some ways, radical goals that Congress incorporated, and it's hard to imagine them being adopted today, but they are still our goals under the Clean Water Act as a country. So I think one more set of changes in 72 that I wanted to put up there just to make the point of how different the modern Clean Water Act was and some of the things that made it different is this slide. There's a list of things here. I want to focus on two of the changes that are, again, most relevant for our work today. The first is the first bullet, which really makes the point that one of the things the Clean Water Act did in 1972 was try to establish a consistent national floor of protection. The idea here was to establish standards and approaches that were consistent all across the country with a goal in some ways of just, if you think about it, stopping, say, a discharger from shopping for the best deal, going to different states or tribal governments and trying to find someone who would give them less restrictive requirements in terms of pollution control. It's kind of the norm before the 1972 changes. By establishing a national, consistent kind of floor of protection, the Clean Water Act made that not possible. So there's consistency across the nation in terms of basic requirements that everybody has to meet. Now, states and tribes can go above that floor. It's not a ceiling, it's a floor, but at least we have this bottom line where nobody can dip below. So that was one of the big changes in 72. The other one I wanted to point out for today's purposes is the last bullet, which involves public involvement. So the Clean Water Act incorporates right into the core, the heart of the law in many different places, requirements for relatively extensive public notice, public comment, and in some cases even public or citizen suits, which allow citizens to kind of act as deputies to enforce the Clean Water Act. And this has really made a difference in terms of implementing the law. To have everyone kind of serve as a watchdog is fundamental to having success with the Clean Water Act. And it really has made a big difference compared to previous environmental laws and previous water quality kind of attempts. So we'll be talking about public involvement throughout the presentation today at different points. You'll see that that's just fundamental to the Act. So before I move on here, I want to mention some people have mentioned that audio is spotty. That really depends on your web interface and your speakers and some of the technological details that you have in place. If you're having any problems at all, go ahead and call in on the phone line that was provided to you and mute your speakers on your computer, and you'll have much better audio over the phone line. So you can see instructions for that in the chat window from Ryan. So that's the 72 law kind of changes in a nutshell. There's a lot that happened in 72, but kind of a quick look at why we talk about that. That is the modern Clean Water Act. But the Act has not been static since that point. It's been amended several times. Most recently in any significant form was 1987. And the 1987 amendments were particularly important to what we're going to be talking about today because they very much address the role of tribes in the Clean Water Act. So you can see here on the slide several things that were done in the Act. The Act is divided into a series of sections that are numbered. So 518 is where the tribal role was really incorporated into the Clean Water Act. And what the 518 did was describe the process for tribes to take over certain provisions of the Act. And I'm going to talk some more about that. And that's really going to be the heart of our discussion today. But you can see that several other very important things were tackled in the 87 amendments, including the addition of non-point source controls, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. So though to focus in on what was most relevant in 1987, it was Section 518. And what 518 did was set up a process whereby tribes can choose to administer several of the core critical Clean Water Act programs. Their tribes aren't required to, but it set up a process if tribes wanted to for them to take on administration of those programs. I've listed a few here: water quality standards, the non-point source program, point source permits, as well as some others we'll talk about today. The process that was established in Section 518 is known in shorthand as Treatment as State, or TAS. I'm probably going to use TAS throughout this presentation, so just remember that refers to this Treatment as State process that was set up in Section 518. And I'm going to note here in several other places throughout the presentation, because there tends to be confusion around this point, this TAS process sets up a process for each Clean Water Act program that the tribe decides to take on. So the tribe gets to decide it wants to take on one, two, several, all Clean Water Act programs, and each time it involves a TAS application and then this process to take on the program. So the good news is it's not all or nothing. The tribe can select what's most useful. Perhaps the bad news is that it does involve this TAS process we'll talk about kind of in repetition, because there are some different things that will be necessary in terms of evidence for taking on the program. So that's Section 518 very briefly. I'm going to pause here to see if we have any questions. If you have any questions that you want to chat, I'm sorry we won't be able to unmute today because of the large group size. Please go ahead and chat them. I don't think we have any at this point other than some of the audio issues, but it looks like we have at least a few people typing. So while they're typing, I'll say the next section here, we're going to go into some more detail on TAS. Second. Oh, so we did get one question here. It says, will or can you address options for tribes in places like Alaska, where tribes do not have a land base and thus no ability for TAS? I will briefly address that. We only have a few Alaska tribes on the line today. When I looked at the RSVP list, so it's going to be brief. But that is something that I thought might be something that folks would like a follow-up, more in-depth discussion about. And if that's the case, I'd really appreciate people raising that so that we can get that on the record and add it into the mix. So I have at least one yes on that and a couple. Okay. So just know I'm going to briefly address that, but because of the relatively small ratio of people where that would be a concern, that would be my preference, is that we have a smaller group discussion where we can really dig into that in more depth. Okay, looks like that's all our questions that we have coming in. If others come in as we go, I'll go back to that basic intro. But let's go ahead and start to talk in a little more detail about this TAS, or treatment estate, under Section 518. So I want to start this section by acknowledging again that this approach might not be for everyone. And it might not be that you want to pursue TAS for all the Clean Water Act programs. You might just want to do it for some or for one. But there are some good reasons for considering going through the TAS process for some of the programs that we're going to discuss later today. As we talk about the programs, I'll talk about the more specific programmatic reasons that it might be attractive for a tribe to consider. But on this slide, I wanted to touch on some of the more generic reasons why the TAS process might be attractive in the Clean Water Act context. So, the first one is just very fundamental. As sovereign governments, tribes may be better suited to set standards that are appropriate, maybe stricter, in order to protect tribal interests and tribal members on your lands. Or it might be setting standards that are better tailored to protect the water quality and the uses that tribes are making of your waters. So maybe not necessarily stricter, but better tailored. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. That's probably the most fundamental reason. Another might be that the TAS for some programs will come along with funding eligibility to do work that you might already want to do, or work that you would consider doing if you had resources. We'll talk a little bit about some of that funding. And it can also, I'm kind of a regulatory geek, so in my mind at least, it can provide enforceable tools under the Clean Water Act for tribes to protect resources that are important to the tribe. So it's not just about these policy steps that we'll be talking about in the end. There's some really enforceable tools that can come along with this. So those are just some general reasons. Again, we'll talk about the more specific reasons as we talk about some of the programs later. But I also wanted to acknowledge, I've already mentioned that this TAS approach might not be for everyone, and it might not be for you in all circumstances. So I wanted to mention that EPA has a guidance that they issued for what's called the 106 program, which we'll talk about a little bit later. They issued this guidance and acknowledged that kind of approach. Another is a tribal standards and ordinances, et cetera, approach that really is based on tribal law and tribal government and doesn't bring the Clean Water Act into play at all. Um, so again, those approaches may be just as relevant and useful or more so for you, depending on your situation, than the TAS approach that we're going to talk about today. And if you want to know more about kind of how EPA laid out these options, I provided the link there to the guidance that discusses kind of how those three approaches are defined and then, kind of how you might even mix them in some cases. And so this is where I was going to mention briefly the situation in Alaska. As has been mentioned, for places like Alaska where tribes don't have a land base, the TAS approach is not necessarily, isn't relevant. It doesn't apply in those places, in those situations. So I wanted to mention for the folks from Alaska or similar situations we have on the phone that the ideas and concepts we're going to talk about today may still be useful. They might be useful to you in terms of just understanding, for example, how the surrounding lands of your state might be using these Clean Water Act tools and how you can engage with them from your tribal government perspective. So that might still be useful. And in terms of using the approaches 1 and 2 listed on the slide, non-regulatory and even more relevant, the tribal standards approach, there's a lot of similarities that might be relevant to your work in terms of establishing or implementing a tribal standards approach and the Clean Water Act kind of approach to these standards. In fact, one of the things I've really been just starting to learn about is how particularly Region 10 EPA has been working with Alaskans, with the tribes in Alaska, to use their tribal standards, even though they're not Clean Water Act standards under this TAS approach, to be really powerful tools. And so that's the kind of thing that I thought might be interesting for a follow-up webinar for folks that are in that situation where TAS isn't relevant, to talk about ideas for using these other approaches in a really meaningful way. And again, this Clean Water Act discussion can provide really useful context for that discussion, even if it's not exactly the approach that you'll end up using. So acknowledging, so we're going to focus in on number 3 here for the rest of the presentation, but try to acknowledge that these other approaches are sometimes as powerful or more so, depending on your circumstances. So getting back to TAS, this is a grossly oversimplified representation of the TAS process. So Section 518 and then the implementing regulations that US EPA has established set up a process for how tribes can take on these different Clean Water Act programs. And this is the generalized process. Tribes address some criteria that have been set up in the statute and in regs for this TAS review. And we're going to walk through those criteria. And tribes will address the Montana test if applicable. And we'll talk in a minute briefly about what the Montana test is. And then EPA has several steps where they conduct an internal review process of that TAS package. And then they propose a findings of fact document. And then they make a final decision on the TAS application. Now this looks very linear and looks very clean. Every example that I've seen of this process indicates that there's a lot of back and forth that goes on between the tribe and the US EPA, usually most intimately with your regional office. So this is very generalized, and there is a lot of back and forth about making sure that that TAS review package is as complete and defensible as possible, making sure that all that, I's are dotted and T's are crossed. But this is the generalized process. I'm going to focus in, for the purposes of this session, on the first 2 steps here, kind of the tribal role. But at the end of this little section, I'm going to give you a link to a webinar that US EPA did that I think is a really good 2-hour webinar about TAS, where they talk about the tribal role and also talk about their internal review and kind of what they have to do with what you all. I'll give you some resources to learn more about those first 2 and then this larger process. So let's talk about the first step, these TAS criteria, information that the tribe puts together as kind of a package for TAS. And these are the 4 criterion here. And we're going to talk about each of them in more detail. So my next couple slides walk through each of these, each of the first four. I want to acknowledge that the fifth one here is just kind of other information. So US EPA may require additional information in order to put together a really defensible decision that it will grant the tribe treatment as state or TAS. So they do have the authority to just ask for additional information from the tribe. But you'll see that the meat of it is in these first four criteria that we're going to talk about in detail in the next couple slides. So we're going to walk through each of these criteria, the first four briefly. As a disclaimer, each of these criteria and each of the kind of submittal pieces that a tribe puts together involve a lot of detailed information. I'm going to provide you again kind of an overview, a short overview here of what might be expected. But again, I'm going to provide you with some resources at the end of this section that go into a lot more detail. We'll spend about 20 minutes on TAS. The EPA webinar was about 2 hours, and they have some other resources that I think are really useful for more information. So let's just talk about each of the first four here briefly. The first is probably the most straightforward. In order to pursue TAS, a tribe needs to be a federally recognized tribe. And basically that can be as simple as providing the legal citation or the actual list of the tribes that have been federally recognized by the Secretary of Interior. And I've included a citation here. This is a list that's published in the Federal Register, which is our kind of national register of official governmental information. As far as I can tell, this is the most recent list, and there are 566 federally recognized tribes on that list. If anybody knows of a more recent version and can chat it, that would be great. Sometimes it's hard to prove the negative, and these do get updated. The second criterion gets into more meat. So this criterion states that a tribe needs to have a governmental body carrying out substantial governmental powers and duties. And so in submitting a TAS application and pursuing the TAS process, a tribe would need to just have a narrative description that demonstrates that these duties and powers are being carried out over a defined area, so over the land that is the tribal land. The application needs, for example, to describe the form of tribal government and the types of governmental functions that government undertakes, and then the source of the tribal authority. So the types of governmental functions, these aren't necessarily environmental functions, but they might be things like police power, taxation. And the sources of authority might range from oral and written traditions to ordinances, etc., to these written kind of documents. So again, there's a lot of detail that can go into this part of the TAS process, but that's the heart of it, describing the form of government, the type of governmental functions, and the sources of tribal authority. And again, I'll give you some resources at the end that go through more explicitly the types of things that should probably be documented in your description under this second criterion. The third criterion is probably, at least in my opinion, and I think most people would agree, the most complicated criterion to kind of fulfill and put together your package on. And this criterion is basically about demonstrating that the tribe has jurisdictional authority over the area that they're proposing to apply these Clean Water Act programs. Again, this includes things like a narrative description of this jurisdictional area, including maybe a map and or a legal description. In the case of a tribe that's looking at water quality standards as a program, and identification of the waters where those water quality standards will be proposed. And the legal basis for the tribe's assertion of authority over this jurisdictional area. So this is quite a legal kind of area of the process and can be pretty complicated. One of the complicating factors might be something called the Montana test. And this, again, is a topic that we're only going to be able to touch on today, and I at least find it a little intimidating, and I think others do as well. So it might be a good example of a place where we would want to have a more in-depth session to follow up and get into more detail. But in short, the Montana test refers to court decisions, several court decisions that were addressing tribal authority over non-member activities on non-member fee lands within this jurisdictional area where Clean Water Act authorities would be as processed as it will be And what the Montana test basically lays out is the need for a tribe that has this situation of non-member activities on these non-member fee lands to explain or describe how they have jurisdiction over these activities in a way that's meaningful. And there's two basic ways that they may have that kind of authority or jurisdiction. The first is if the non-members are enter into consensual relationships with the tribe or its members, things like contracts, etc. The second, which is reportedly much more common, and you'll see a lot more in EPA materials about it, is if these non-member activities, their conduct can threaten or has some direct effect on the political integrity, the economic security, or the health and welfare of the tribe. So by explaining how those activities could impact those kinds of factors, political integrity, economic security, health or welfare of the tribe, you can document that the tribe actually will have jurisdiction or authority over these types of activities and hence meet what's called the Montana test. I have a question here. Somebody says, can you post a link for more information on the Montana test? I will at the end of this section. I'll be putting some up. So watch for that. And also, again, if it's something people are interested in, it'd be a great one to nominate for a follow-up session on. We could bring in some attorneys who could really go into detail on this. I know a bit about the Montana test, but there's people that could really do a much better job than I'm going to be able to do. So, but that's the long and short of it. It's a test that can be of concern and can require some work, some legwork to really kind of document your findings on, but it's not an insurmountable test either. So people just need to really be aware of it, think about it ahead of time as you're putting together your task package. And I will also show you some links to more information. But before we get to that, the fourth criterion is simply demonstrating a capacity to administer the program that you're pursuing TAS for. Again, this might vary based on the program. But you see here, this is kind of a text-heavy slide. This is pulled from a lot of the EPA materials on this particular piece of the TAS package. But I want to point out a few things that are listed here in terms of documenting the capacity to administer a program. So the first one I wanted to point out is the very first bullet, previous management experience with similar programs. This doesn't have to be even an environmental program, let alone a water program. It's just showing how the tribe has experience with running programs, kind of delivering these types of services to tribal members or over your landscape. So even if you don't have an existing environmental program, other programs are relevant for this capacity to administer question. The second bullet, though, is more about programs related to the water quality program that you might be contemplating taking on. And that includes environmental programs and public health kind of programs, which might be what you think of kinds of things that you might need to have, skills and capacities you might need to have to run a water quality program. So very relevant there. The other thing I wanted to point out was the second to last bullet here, the technical and administrative capacity of staff. So this might be specific to the program that you're proposing to take on under the Clean Water Act. So for example, Water Quality Standards Program, you might need different technical skills than if you're taking on the 319 non-point source program we'll talk about in a little while. But you would want to document what capacity you have already on staff, or importantly, the last bullet, a plan to develop the capacity. So US EPA does not necessarily require that every single skill be checked, the box be checked. But if you don't have those kind of capacities, you do need to have some sort of plan in place, whether that's a training kind of plan, resources that you're going to bring on board, things that will demonstrate that you have a plan to develop that capacity over a reasonable amount of time. So that is the quick overview of the four criterion. And again, for each of these, there's quite a bit of detail that is involved and usually quite a bit of back and forth with US EPA to make sure that all the bases are covered and that there's a defensible kind of package for the TAS application. I have one set of just miscellaneous facts I wanted to throw out there before we leave this section. The first is just that the TAS application and the EPA's decision on it is, again, for each program that the tribe might decide to pursue. which we're going to talk about the kind of a range of them in the next section. So you don't have to decide to take on the Clean Water Act, which is good. You're taking on a piece that's relevant to what you all need. But that does mean you have to go through this TAS process in separate times for separate programs. However, US EPA did note in several places in my research that materials submitted for one application can be referenced in a follow-up application for another program, as long as it's up to date and relevant to that application. So a lot of the jurisdictional work, et cetera, will really help you in the next time you decide to go down that road. Another thing that often seems to come up in terms of questions is, particularly if you're pursuing the Water Quality Standards Program, people wonder, well, do I have to put together this TAS package or application and my water quality standards at the same time? And you do not. You can, but it really, for US EPA's purposes, they must have an approved TAS for the tribe before they can review and approve your water quality standards. So they may do them back to back if you submit the two things together, but the TAS submission and its approval needs to come first. So from their perspective, there's no need for you to have your water quality standards done when you're pursuing the TAS for the water quality. But it can be a relatively big issue. So do learn more about that if you're concerned about non-member activities. And again, we may be able to offer some follow-up support to help with that, and definitely US EPA's materials will. So on that point, let me give you these links I've been promising. And this will get back to Katie's question about information on the Montana test as well. The first link here is what I thought was a very good 2-hour EPA webinar on TAS for the Water Quality Standards Program. So that's a shortened link there so that you can get to it without typing in 8,000 letters. But you can also just find it on EPA's tribal training website. That goes through a lot more detail on the criterion that we just walked through, and also, again, shares some information about EPA's internal process and kind of what they're going to have to do with your application, which is very enlightening. They also have an example from a tribe that went through the TAS process and kind of the pros and cons. I found it very useful, and you may too if you haven't gone down this road, in terms of resources invested and the return that they're seeing on that work. The second bullet is a very important document out of US EPA. If you're going down the TAS road, it lays out EPA's strategies for reviewing applications. And again, I think it's good to just know kind of what EPA is working, the structure they're working within as they're trying to respond to applications. So give you some good insight. And particularly, Appendix C, it goes into some, I think, useful detail on the Montana test and what kinds of things a tribe can use to demonstrate that they meet the test, they pass the test. And the last one is just the general TAS page for the Clean Water Act at EPA, and it has links to these and many other things. So I'm seeing in the chat window a question about emailing us the PDF of the presentation. I'll let our tech person respond, but I think that's possible. I think we have a list of everybody who's on the phone today, and we could send you a PDF. He's also, it looks like, putting those links into the chat box. So if you want, you can click on them right there as we go and have them open in your windows. But I think we should be able to send a PDF. So with that, any other questions about the presentation? About that TAS presentation? Oh, and I see our tech guru, Ryan, says we can post a PDF along with the presentation recording on our website. Good idea, Ryan. Any other questions? I don't see. Either I'm being very clear or I'm being incredibly overwhelming. Oh, we've got a couple people typing, it looks like. So I'll pause here and say the next section here, we're going to talk about a few of the core Clean Water Act programs that might be particularly of interest to the tribes. And it's going to be a whirlwind tour. So what we're going to do for each of, I think, 6 or 7 programs is give you one slide overview and then one slide about the possible tribal role and why you might be interested. But again, I will post at the end webinars that go into more detail. So, okay, one question here is how long does the TAS process take? From what I can tell, it seems to vary enormously. So I would suggest really starting by talking with your regional EPA office about the process and their expectations and trying to decide, what that means in terms of a timeline jointly with them. There is a lot of back and forth, it seems, on pretty much every TAS application. US EPA, the 2008 strategy that I shared with you earlier, was an attempt to streamline the TAS process. And they do seem quite committed to trying to move through this process with tribes. But there have been challenges of TAS kind of decisions and kind of implementation, so it really does need to be a fully complete and defensible package that the decision is based on. So it's really going to depend on the specifics of the issues of your particular tribal kind of reality. So I can't give you a specific amount of months or years, I'm sorry to say. Let me see, I'm going to do at least one more here. So there's how long does it take? Here's a question. For the 106 funding, do you have to have TAS status? Yes, you do. But we will talk about that a little later in the process. And then Scott says, he has a comment, Merritt, you can use EPA gap funding to develop TAS. And that's true. So people should know that, and we will maybe touch on that a little bit later if we have time. Let's see, Heidi has a question here. It says, in the case of a checkerboarded reservation, if a tribe fails to prove that the Montana test, parentheses, direct effect, what other recourse might they have for regulating non-member activity to meet water quality standards? The Montana test really is something that the tribe will need to wrestle with in terms of getting TAS for water quality standards. If you can't meet that Montana test, you won't be granted TAS, and so you won't have Clean Water Act standards. Now, the other options we talked about in the beginning in terms of in terms of voluntary approaches and tribal standards or tribal governmental kind of approaches would still apply that in terms of water quality standards and then the implementing programs. So Heidi, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but again, this I think would be a ripe area for more discussion in a more in-depth webinar if you're interested. Okay, Heidi says yes, at least for now. Okay. All right, well, let's do our whirlwind tour here of Clean Water Act programs that might be of interest to tribes. There's a lot. There are many Clean Water Act programs, and there's many that would be of interest to you all today. So I've just selected a few here that I think would be most relevant, in part because they're TAS-related, what we've just talked about, and in part because there's just very clear benefits to tribes in terms of considering taking them on. So we're going to talk about each of these in a very quick way, as I say, kind of 2 slides each. But then we will talk about where you can get more resources at the end of this section. So for each of these, I have kind of a question, that we might face in terms of water quality and then the Clean Water Act answer. So the first program we're going to talk about really answers the question of what is it we value about our waters and what are our goals for our rivers or lakes or wetlands. I'm a river biased clearly here, but what are our goals in terms of what we want from water quality and when we think about our waters? So the Clean Water Act's answer to trying to answer those questions is the Water Quality Standards Program. I'm going to touch on this briefly here because we're going to talk about it in much more detail later in the presentation. But water quality standards are really the way that we define what it is we want in terms of water quality. Usually states develop these, or in the case of our subject today, tribes can develop water quality standards with review and oversight from US EPA. And water quality standards are made up of 3 pieces. I'll touch on them briefly, and then we're going to talk about in more detail later and look at actual examples. But the 3 pieces you see laid out here, the first are designated uses. And uses are basically defining what it is we as humans or aquatic life or wildlife want to do with our waterways. So examples of designated uses might be swimming or recreation, supporting cold water fisheries, ceremonial uses we'll see some examples of later. And these uses can be current uses, things that we're currently doing with our waters, or they might be aspirational. Maybe they're not currently uses that are safe, but they're things we want to be able to do with our waters. For example, maybe they can be these aspirational goals as well. Related to uses are water quality criteria, the second piece. And water quality criteria are basically measuring sticks for us to decide if the uses that we've identified are supported, if it's safe for us to swim there, if it's a place that the cold water fish can thrive. There are ways to measure if those uses are being met. So for example, if you had a cold water fishery, one of the criteria you establish might be setting up, how much dissolved oxygen really needs to be in that water in order for trout to be able to survive and thrive. So that's a water quality criteria, that measure of dissolved oxygen. The third piece is a little bit different, but it's fascinating. It's a concept known as anti-degradation. Water quality standards include a policy and implementation procedures for anti-degradation. And the basic idea behind anti-degradation is that there's value to keeping clean waters clean, that where we have healthy systems, there's a value to keeping them healthy, and we want a system to be able to do that. So again, we're going to talk more about water quality standards in the next section. For now, I just want to say that the Water Quality Standards Program for tribes has been a program where there's been a lot of interest and activity in taking on and going through the TAS process and then developing water quality standards. And in part, in a lot of cases, it's because establishing appropriate uses for tribal waters has been seen as important. Some of those uses are different than we might see the states adopting. Another reason might be that the tribe wanted to establish stronger criteria. And also because water quality standards can be useful in terms of protecting against upstream dischargers or other kinds of threats to tribal waters. So those are some reasons why I think perhaps tribes have been particularly interested in the Water Quality Standards Program under the Clean Water Act. So again, we'll come back to standards and talk about them more in the future. But the second program I want to touch on here is the program that would help with that under the Clean Water Act. And there is. It's known as the 401 Water Quality Certification. 401, again, just refers to the section of the Act where this program was kind of birthed, where it was born. And in short, what the certification program does is it allows states and tribes that have approved water quality standards, and in some cases EPA, it allows those entities to review certain federal permits that are discharging into a water of the U.S. and review those permits to see if they'll comply with water quality standards. So in the case of a tribe and if you have your water quality standards, you can check and see if this activity is going to threaten to violate those standards. And the tribe has several options if they have this authority. They can just certify that, yes, it's going to meet standards, it's fine for this activity to move forward. They can certify it, but place some protective conditions to make sure standards won't be violated. Those might be, best management practices like putting a silt fence in. Might be at the time that the work is allowed to happen, maybe not during a spawning kind of time period. Might be monitoring conditions. So they can basically place all kinds of different conditions on the activity. The tribe may also deny certification, and if it is denied, the federal activity, the permitted activity, simply cannot move forward. Without that certification, the activity is stopped, very powerful, or the tribe can waive certification, just not take action. So you can see this is a pretty powerful program because particularly in the case of denial, you stop an activity, and frankly, just the threat of that often brings people to the table, the implicit threat, not so much even the explicit, to discuss things like protective conditions. A lot can be done with this authority simply through placing some of these protective conditions on a particular activity. So we've seen this be very powerful in the states and in some cases with tribes. So that might be why a tribe would want to consider taking on this role. And one of the nice things is you get what's essentially a twofer. If you get TAS, if you go after TAS and then get approved water quality standards for this program, the tribe also gets 401 authority, so this authority to review federal permits. You do need to designate it the entity that's going to decide this in your application. So, so that can be a really important role here for tribes if they pursue the water quality standards route. I see a question from Claudia that says, is there training for reviewing and writing permits? And Claudia, it'd be great if you could, do you mean 401 certifications specifically or permits generally, like some of the other programs we'll talk about? If you clarify that, I will be able to follow up better. Because the next core program I want to talk about here is pollution control permits. So this answers the question of how under the Clean Water Act do we limit industrial pollution or sewage, kind of these big pipes and related things that we see when we're thinking about water quality. The Clean Water Act's answer to that is the Point Source Discharge Program, also known as the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES system. And what the Clean Water Act established with this system is that it's illegal to discharge without a permit to the waters of the U.S. It didn't make it illegal to discharge pollution, but it did make it illegal to do so without a permit. And these permits have important requirements built into them. These include limits on how much can be discharged, monitoring requirements, in some cases best management practices. The permits contain a lot of important information and requirements that really help reduce pollution. This is a program that's largely delegated to the states to administer, just so you know. There's only, I think I'm right here, 4 states left that do not actually issue these permits at the state level. I think those are Idaho, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New Mexico. In those states, US EPA issues the discharge permits, and DC and the territories. So just so you know, if you're working with this program, you'll largely be working with your state, but US EPA does retain, again, kind of oversight and review authority over what's going on with permits in the states. So you'll be working with your state in connection with US EPA. So one other comment here I want to point out in the submit question thing from Scott is the 401 certification allows a tribe a seat at the table on the protection of tribal interest. I think it's a great way of summarizing that last slide about some of the benefits of 401. Again, it gives you a certain amount of power in terms of making decisions on these sorts of permitted activities, particularly in states where there's a lot of federal permits that are issued, things like Army Corps of Engineers permits we'll talk about in a minute. In some states, these point source discharge permits, as I've just mentioned, are issued by US EPA, FERC permits. So Scott's exactly right. It can give you a seat at the table in a very meaningful way. So tribes and NPDES permits, tribes can receive TAS for the NPDES program. No tribes have. It is a pretty intensive resource program, but it's something that is available for tribes. But regardless of these permits, that's a federal permit. And if you have the Water Quality Standards Program, tribes can use their 401 authority to weigh in on those permits. So that's one angle. Even where you don't have 401 authority, you can comment on permit proposals as your state issues them. There's public notice and comment incorporated into the permitting process. As I mentioned, for the Clean Water Act, it's a core principle. And tribes have every right to comment on them. And if you have water quality standards and you're a downstream kind of recipient of that wastewater, you might have a very powerful position from which to argue your comments, even if you don't have the 401 kind of authority that you can apply to a federal permit. So this is some ideas for the NPDES program. Kind of the flip side of the program, of the concept here of point source pollution from industrial facilities or sewage treatment plants or stormwater, is the idea of, well, what about runoff from farms, from lawns? As most of us probably know, this is the largest remaining source of problems in our country, this non-point source pollution. I mentioned earlier that in 1987, the Clean Water Act was amended in part to add a program that's focused on this. It's known as the 319 program, the Non-Point Source Pollution Control Program. And it essentially set up a three steps or 3 pieces of an approach that states, and if they opt-in, tribes can use to manage non-point source pollution control. You see them laid out here. It's basically assessing the problem, establishing a program for control, and then a funding mechanism to help pay for some of this work on the ground. So one important difference about the 319 program compared to the point source permit program is that, at least under the Clean Water Act, non-point source pollution control is a voluntary program. States and tribes might have regulatory programs. Clean Water Act's approach is voluntary. So you can see I've kind of noted that here because it does really change the way you might think about control. But it's there. And the item number three here, the grants for on-the-ground work, is really where a lot of people focus when they think about this program. Is US EPA does have resources that they receive annually from Congress that they then distribute to states and tribes for non-point source pollution control work. And that, of course, is very attractive. So that funding mechanism is an important piece of the program. So for tribes, this is another program where you can pursue TAS and then take on the program. Many have, maybe in part because of this funding that's tied to it. You would need to go through the process of developing this non-point source assessment and then the program in order to get those grants. But they do exist, and they're sort of touch on here briefly. Restoring impaired waters, what do we do if we still have troubled waters? That under the Clean Water Act is known as the 303D program. Again, just referring to where it is in the law. And under the Clean Water Act, if we have waters that don't meet water quality standards, that is it's a very simple approach envisioned by the Act. It's not so simple in reality. The Act basically says, well, we want to identify those places, those waters, prioritize them for restoration, and then develop a total maximum daily load. And that load is essentially a restoration plan that says, how are we going to reduce pollutant inputs to the point where it's going to meet water quality standards. For those of you who are familiar with this program, it has become much more complicated than that, both politically and technically. But that's the basic idea. Tribes can pursue TAS for 303D, but no tribe has yet successfully received TAS. But even without taking over the program, it's a useful program to know about because, again, it might be useful if you're thinking about restoration efforts to look at the 303D approach and think about how that might inform what you're doing. And it also can be important to gauge in your state's process because in a lot of cases what's going on, in their impaired waters might affect your waters on tribal lands. So it really is important to know about, even if it's not a program that you're eager to take on. Two more quick programs here. The first is a question of how do we protect and restore wetlands, and also how do we address stream alteration issues. The Clean Water Act does have an approach for that. Again, numeric kind of names here, but that program is known as the 404 program. So this program, again, is you often hear it referred to as the wetlands program, but it's as much stream alteration issues as wetlands. And like the point source program, it doesn't make it illegal to fill a wetland or alter a stream, but it does require a permit in order to do so. And a couple of things, even on this overview, I want to make sure you guys leave with are on this slide here. The first is the idea of sequencing. So the heart of the permitting approach under 404 is supposed to be this idea of kind of a three-step process. The first is that the permittee will avoid harm to wetlands and streams, so avoid kind of filling, riprapping, etc. So that might involve moving the project, changing the footprint, etc., but avoiding impacting water resources is the first step. For things that can't be avoided, you are supposed to minimize those impacts. So maybe it's a different design for a stream crossing, things that will minimize the effect that the project is going to have on water resources. And then the third step is where you can't avoid or minimize, mitigate. And mitigation is, again, a quite complicated subject, but the idea there is where we can't avoid harm, say, to a stream or wetland, we're going to mitigate for the values that are lost somewhere else. Might be in the program. The day-to-day program is really run by the Army Corps of Engineers, although EPA retains oversight. It's kind of different entity to work with if you're interested in this program. EPA, though, it does still have a role. And like with the other programs, tribes can pursue TAS, and states can have this program delegated to them, much as they do the point source program. Unlike the Point Source program, though, only 2 states have taken over this program. Those are Michigan and New Jersey. So if you're thinking about engaging in the wetlands arena, you're mostly thinking about working with the Army Corps and US EPA, although states and tribes might have their own wetlands program. But important thing to note here is even if the tribe doesn't want to pursue TAS for the wetlands program, if you have the 401 certification authority, you can weigh in on these permits because they're federal permits. So if you have that authority, you can go through those steps of certifying, placing conditions, denying, etc. So it's important to keep in mind that you still have tools if you have that certification program. So last but not least, I wanted to touch on the 106 program, which has come up several times. It kind of answers, among other things, the question of how the heck do we set up and run all these programs? That's a big question, but part of the answer that's relevant, particularly to tribes, is the 106 program. That this is a program that provides funding to states and tribes to establish and implement programs. So it's focused on things like program development and administration, reporting, monitoring, and data analysis. It really is kind of a functional program that supports a lot of the other things you might want to do. So just out of curiosity, who on the phone, raise your hand if you have TAS and you have the 106 program through your tribal government. Anybody on the phone? Looks like we have quite a few people here. I'm just scanning here. All right, a lot of you, more than, I think it looks like more than any other program that we've talked about. Okay. All right. Well, go ahead and put your hands down, but that makes good sense. So, by tribes, most recent numbers I could find were from 2009, but of the then 562 federally recognized tribes, there were 337 that met the criteria for 106 and 252 that had TAS approval for 106. So quite a few. So that is our whirlwind tour of Clean Water Act programs. Running a little behind here, but I want to point out that we do have resources here that go into all of those topics and more from the Clean Water Act in more detail, including this online course, which can be really useful. It has lessons on water quality standards and permitting, wetlands permits, 401 certification, and these other resources as well go through a lot of this material, our webinars as well as the Clean Water Act Owner's Manual. So I'm going to just scan through here quickly to make sure there's not any emergency questions. Some of these are more advanced, and I may have to circle back around and talk to you in more depth later. Oh, and good. It looks like you guys are sharing information amongst yourselves, too, which is good. All right. Well, in the interest of time, because I want to make sure we have some time for the polls at the end, I'm going to jump into the next section here and talk just a little bit more about water quality standards. So this is the actual language in the Clean Water Act, the goal that I shorthanded as fishable and swimmable. And I put this up again to remind us this is the goal that's probably most relevant to water quality standards. And it really talks about, this goal of having all our waters be fishable and swimmable, again, shorthand for, supporting healthy aquatic ecosystems and, being safe for people to recreate in and on. This goal is a great goal, but there's kind of immediately begs the question of, well, how are we going to define that and how do we know if we achieved it? And that's where water quality standards really come in. And again, we've touched on reasons why the tribe might want to take on this particular program. I think you probably can internalize some of them a little bit better having done the whirlwind tour of core programs, especially the 401 authority, but really the standards are the basis of everything that we contemplate doing under the Clean Water Act. So let's just look at a few examples here of the pieces of standards. And before we get to that, I want to touch on the process for taking on the Water Quality Standards Program. Again, this is a gross simplification of what's a lot of back and forth and hard work. But just to make sure it's clear, tribe applies for TAS for standards. So you put together that package we talked about, and then EPA reviews and approves it. And then the tribe develops their standards, and then USDA EPA approves those standards. So there's several steps for the tribes and 2 discrete approvals that are required from US EPA to fully take on the Water Quality Standards Program. It's worth noting here that you don't have to develop your standards in a vacuum. You can base them on other tribe standards, on federal standards that are out there, on your neighboring state standards if they're relevant, or develop your own altogether. And I think in most cases what you'll find is it'll be some mix of this. There's lots of things where you don't have to create things anew. It'll be great to be able to beg, borrow, and steal from elsewhere. But then there's some things that are going to be unique to your situation where you really would want to develop your own standards. So I'm going to look here again. This is the three primary pieces that we touched on earlier. And again, I'm just going to talk briefly about each one and show you some examples before we get to the end of this section. And then I'll give you resources for learning more about each of these. So designated uses, as we talked about earlier, these are the goals for what we want to use our waters for. It also can be industrial uses and agricultural uses for the water. So these are our broad goals. And again, they can be existing, things that we're doing now, or aspirational goals. You can see here I've underlined, it says whether or not those uses are actually currently being attained. They're just the uses that a tribe identifies in their water quality standards. Another thing to know about these uses that I personally find kind of amazing is they're designated, they're established as categories of uses in your tribal water quality standards, but they're also assigned to individual water bodies, rivers, lakes, whatever, and segments of water bodies on tribal lands or in states. In some cases you have default uses that apply and then special ones that are added, but regardless, any creek, any backyard creek that you look at is going to have a designated use or more likely uses associated with it. It's kind of an amazing concept to me. So let's look at an example here of tribal designated uses. This is from, the next few pages are from the Grand Portage Band of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribes Approved Water Quality Standards. As you look here, you can see the underlined text. Those are designated uses. And if you look, there's also what I would call kind of sub-uses, also underlined with numbers. Under aquatic life, you'll see there's cold water fishery and warm water fishery. So different kind of level of designated use, getting into some specifics there, because you might have different water quality criteria associated with those. Cold water, for example, might have a different temperature standard or criterion than warm water fishery. So you can see here that they have uses and then these kind of sub-uses as well. I also want to point out the A and the B. Often you'll see the shorthand for uses used. So aquatic life, cold water fisheries might be referred to as B1. You'll see that pretty regularly in standards. So let's look at, you see a few of their designated uses here. They go on to talk about several more aquatic life uses, substantive fishing, wetlands, and then they go into wildlife, recreation, cultural. I want to point out that the subsistence fishing here could be an example of where specific knowledge of how tribal members are using a fisheries resource, i.e. in this case maybe consuming more fish than the consumption numbers that EPA or a state might assume, could be driving a more tailored and hence more protective use designation for the tribal uses of these waters and hence more protective water quality criteria. So that use there might be an example of a benefit of this tribe developing their own standards. That use that the tribe has of these areas for wild rice. It's E1, again, at the very bottom of your screen. So remember that. Remember the E1 is cultural wild rice areas, because I'm going to quiz you about it in a second. And this is the last page of their standards. You can see they have another cultural use of aesthetics, and then things like forestry and industrial uses and navigation. So that just rounds out the use of the list of their uses. So another piece also from the Grand Portage Band's standards is, again, this assigning of those categories of use to specific waters on the tribal lands. So you can see here they have a list of their waters, and then on the far right-hand side they have a list of the designated uses. So here's your quiz. I remember that I asked you to keep in mind that E1 was a label for cultural wild rice areas. Who can use the chat box to tell me an example of a water that's designated, has a designated use as cultural wild rice area? Anybody can spot one of the E1 wild rice area waters? Chat it to me. I see some people are typing. Heidi is a fast typer, She says North Lake. Correct. Cuffs Lake, Center Lake. All right, we've got a couple people that are on it here. So yes, you can see there's quite a few of them, like the Center Lake, Cuffs Lake, Helmer Nelson Pond. Oops, I just circled 3 of the many that are there. So everybody who responded there was correct. There's quite a few of them that have been designated, and you can see that all these waters also have multiple designated uses. So in different scenarios, those uses might be more protective of certain kinds of things than other uses. So when we get to the water quality criteria, if you're concerned about trout, you might be most concerned about temperature and dissolved oxygen. If you're most concerned about recreation, you might be most concerned about bacteria. So having multiple designated uses in place, protects for those uses by applying different water quality criteria. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about criteria here. This is just from the regulations defining criteria, and it just says that they have to protect multiple uses, but for any particular pollutant, a different use might be more sensitive. Again, DO for trout, bacteria for people swimming. But regardless, you have to go with the most sensitive use, not the least sensitive, which of course makes some sense. So let's look at some, I forgot, I put this in there. Before we get to the examples, I wanted to point out that there's 2 different kinds of criteria. Numeric, which are maybe what we think of, very numeric, and measurable benchmarks for water quality parameters. So you see here there's some examples like an acceptable concentration or acceptable range, like pH might be within a certain range. Narratives are a little different. They describe water quality goals, and that might be a desirable condition, something that we want, or it might be something we don't want. You often see these free from standards. My personal favorite is free from scum and floating debris. The idea behind these is it's impossible to write a numeric standard for every single pollutant that might occur or every single situation that might occur. So these narrative standards are a way to really capture more holistically what we're trying to achieve. On the other hand, they can be pretty hard to implement. You have to translate that standard into, say, a permit limit for a wastewater treatment plant. There's some challenges there. But still, they are a powerful, useful tool. They just are a little complicated. Before I move on, I want to answer a question that came up that asked, are designated uses typically for an entire stream, or can they be for a certain reach? They can, in fact, be for a reach. So I was saying for a water body or a segment of a water body. So segment might be another way of saying reach. Sometimes it is the whole water body. More often, you'll see kind of areas, reaches, segments, whatever you want to call them, kind of called out with different designated uses. So let's look quickly here at some examples. These are from the Taos Pueblo's approved water quality standards. You see these are narrative standards, and an example largely of the free from approach that I mentioned. So you can see from quite general, the first one, free from things that harm human health or cause a public safety problem. Pretty broad. And then maybe more specific would be number 6, anything causing objectionable taste, odor, color, etc. in the water body. Number 5 includes my favorite, the scum and float and foam. So you can see that they're general in nature, and so could be a challenge to implement, but also address some really important issues that can come up in terms of water quality. In a numeric example, also from the Pueblo standards here, we've got the fisheries use on top and the agriculture, water, and wildlife watering use on the bottom chart. As you can see, the idea here is just what we've been talking about. You've got some parameters, some specific pollutants, and then you've got the numeric measurable benchmark tied to their designated use. So, for example, looking at the fisheries chart, who can use the chat to tell me what is the maximum temperature allowable in a cold water fishery on Taos Pueblo? Anybody? And well, that's dissolved oxygen. Is that what I said? I meant to say temperature, but yes, that's temperature. That is what I said. 68 Fahrenheit, right? So we've got answers here that are to the temperature and the dissolved oxygen. But you can see here. Right there is what we're looking at for temperature. That's, not to exceed 28 C or 68 Fahrenheit. So pretty basic. These numbers are tied to the designated use. Not to scare you, but it's not always as simple as that. This is a chart from the Navajo Nation's approved standards of numeric criteria. And you can see that when we get into metals and other parameters, it can get much more complicated. The list of pollutants is long, but if your eyes aren't totally blurred over, you can see that the same idea applies here. We've got a list of parameters down the left side and across the top. You've got different, well, mostly different designated uses, and then the limits that are related, the criteria that are related to those designated uses. So I don't want to be overwhelming here, but there is a lot that goes into these water quality standards. But that basic idea is what you need to keep in mind. So last but not least is anti-degradation. This is a complicated and near and dear to my heart subject. We're just going to talk about it in brief here, but anti-degradation basically says, as we mentioned earlier, that we want to, where we have good quality water, there's a value to keeping that good quality. And usually what happens in water quality standards is that 3 tiers of protection are established to help make this idea functional. You often hear it talked about in terms of 3 categories of waters. I really prefer and think it's more appropriate, given the law, to think of it as tiers of protection. And those tiers are, first off, what's called Tier 1. And that tier essentially holds the line and says, no matter what, we really want to maintain and protect all of our existing uses. And existing uses is kind of a legal term of art that we could get into in a more advanced session, but essentially protect the uses that we have. For example, we shouldn't be writing water quality standards. That's Tier 1. Tier 2 is about where we have better quality water than just barely meeting our criteria. The concept is that there's some value in the fact that there's good quality water there, and we would want to, as a community, limit the degradation of the water quality in those situations. Tier 2 does not establish a bar to degradation, but establishes some tests that need to be kind of passed in order to allow degradation. And those tests have to do with looking at alternatives. Are there alternatives to degrading the water quality? And does the degradation support important local and economic social development? And some other tests. So again, it's not a bar, but the idea is let's only degrade water where there's no alternative and it's really important for the local economy or social development. So it's Tier 2. And then Tier 3 is a kind of different creature. It says there's some places that are just so special, we're going to strictly protect them from degradation. With the exception of perhaps some temporary degradation, they're just not going to be allowed to be degraded. So those waters are called in the Clean Water Act language outstanding national resource waters. States often name them after themselves, so like outstanding Alabama resource waters. Tribes might call them outstanding tribal waters, but they're places that are truly special that we're protecting for ecological, recreational, or in the case of tribes, perhaps cultural values. So here is an example, and I may say this wrong, I apologize, but from, I believe it's the St. Gigis, I hope that's right, Mohawk tribe standards, their approved standards of their anti-degradation policy. You can see that for the policy, they mimic these 3 tiers pretty closely. And then I didn't put it all up here, but they have an implementation procedure down there at the bottom. Just the first few sentences there are included. So this is something that would be included in tribal standards as well. So those are the 3 main pieces with at least a few examples of how tribes have brought them on board into their water quality standards. Again, this is a whirlwind tour. I thought US EPA's standards webinar was quite good. It's not tribal specific, but it's quite about standards that you can see linked there. So you can learn more on any of the specifics of standards through those resources, as well as the earlier Clean Water Act resources that we talked about. And again, this might be a place where y'all would want to request more work in the future.